15-minute or less lecture series, Anatomy and Physiology, Chapter 10, The Senses, Part 2. Hearing and equilibrium, we're moving on to equilibrium. There are two kinds of equilibrium, static equilibrium and dynamic equilibrium. Static equilibrium is basically the position of the head relative to gravity, and it is localized to the vestibule area, specifically utricle and saccules within the vestibule. And then dynamic equilibrium, helping to maintain balance, is all it has to do with the movement of head and body. Dynamic equilibrium is localized to the ampulla of the semicircular canals. Static equilibrium in the vestibule. What we find within the utricle and saccule is these structures called the macula. Macula is a thickened area where you have these hair cells localized, and those hair cells are receptors attached to the sensory neurons. The hair cells have their hairs pushed up into this gelatinous mass called the autolytic membrane. Within that autolytic membrane are little crystals called otoliths. Your head is in one relative position. If you turn your head into a slightly different position, gravity will pull onto the autolytic membrane and it will move. The gelatinous mass will move toward the direction of gravity, bending the hair cells. Bending of the hair cells will then generate a signal in the hair cells that will get sent down the sensory neurons. So again, static equilibrium, type of mechanoreceptors that is basically telling you where your head is relative to gravity. Dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium is localized primarily to the ampulla of the semicircular canals. Within the ampulla, you have this structure called a cupula. A cupula is a cartilaginous structure that sits upright within the fluids of the semicircular canals. There are many, many hair cells that then have their hair parts embedded in the cupula. And then what happens is when you turn your head in a direction, basically a rotational movement is occurring, then a current will generate along the semicircular canal that is in that same orientation. That current will then push and move on the cupula. The cupula will bend, bending the hair of the hair cells, leading to a generation of a signal. So again, the hair cells here are mechanoreceptors. Turns out our semicircular canals go into three orientations of 3D space, so that no matter which way your head is moving, you'll be able to generate this sensation. It's worth knowing that children love this dynamic equilibrium sense. They love to play with it by spinning in circles really, really fast, getting really, really dizzy. Moving on to vision. Vision, we have the complicated structures of the eye. This includes accessory structures such as the eyelids that can close in front of the eyeball. The epithelial tissue lining the eyeball and the inside of the eyelid called the conjunctiva. It is a mucous membrane that produces a little bit of mucus to keep lubrication there so that the eyelids can move across the eyeball without damaging it. The only place you don't have the conjunctiva is at the actual lens of the eye. The lacrimal glands. Lacrimal glands are found on the lateral side of the eyeball, superior to them. Lacrimal glands produce the tear fluid, helps to lubricate and cleanse the eye. We're always producing a little bit of tear fluid to keep them moist and clean. Eventually, the tear fluid makes it to the medial corners of the eyes, where they'll enter the nasolacrimal duct that then empties into the nasal cavity, so that the tear fluids end up going into the nasal cavity. This is why you get a runny nose when you cry, because there's just a lot of fluid going into the nasal cavity. The tear fluid or lacrimal fluid also contains some antibacterial enzyme called lysozyme to try to prevent eye infections. Muscles of the eye. We have 6 muscles of the eye: superior rectus, inferior rectus, lateral rectus, and medial rectus. We also have the 2 obliques: superior oblique making a U-turn and inferior oblique. These muscles move the eye. We have 3 layers to the eyeball itself. We have the outer layer. The outermost layer or fibrous layer includes the cornea. Cornea is this clear region in the anterior side of the eyeball. You can actually touch this with your finger if you want. It's where contact lenses are normally placed. And then there's the white of the eye, the sclera, which is a very dense structure that allows for the attachment of muscles and give overall protection to the eyeball. And then coming out of the posterior side of the eyeball is the optic nerve. The optic nerve and blood vessels pierce the sclera to enter the posterior side of the eye. The middle layer or middle tunic includes the choroid coat. The choroid coat is a very highly vascular structure with lots of blood vessels in it. It's darkly pigmented, so it both helps to nourish the tissues of the eye and absorb any stray light rays bouncing around inside the eye. Toward the anterior side, we have the ciliary body. This forms a ring around the front of the eye. It helps to hold the lens of the eye in place and can also change the shape of the lens. And then at the very anterior region, we have this strip of smooth muscle tissue called the iris. The iris is then able to adjust the size of the pupil to control the amount of light entering the eye. So here is the ciliary body with its little processes and the fibers attaching to the iris. Attaching to the lens. Ciliary body attaches to the lens. And then, so when they relax, it allows us to focus on distant objects. When they contract, they shorten the eyeball, allowing us to view things closer. Iris, again, the iris dilates to allow more light in when it's dark, constricts to allow less light in when it is very bright. Within the area, we have what's called the anterior chamber and posterior chamber. These chambers are filled with aqueous humor. This is just a fluid that circulates through these chambers to keep those tissues safe and alive and the cornea properly pushed outward. Toward the back of the eye, we also have the retina is the innermost layer. It is only found toward the back of the eye and the middle part of the eye. So here is the retina. It has the photoreceptors, so it detects light. So the specialized structure called the macula lutea. And at the center of the macula lutea is the fovea centralis. This is where we get the sharpest, best vision possible. In the retina, we have lots of neurons that then connect to photoreceptors. The photoreceptors are called the rods and cones. Rods detect dim light and only see in black and white. Cones detect bright light and can see in color. They're then connected to lots of neurons that lead to the optic nerve. Optic disc. Optic disc is the area where the optic nerve is penetrating the eyeball. At the optic disc, there are no photoreceptors. So this is a blind spot. So the optic disc is a blind spot. Filling this huge chamber is vitreous humor, which is primarily a cartilaginous mass called the vitreous body. And this helps to support the internal structures of the eye and help the eye maintain its basic shape. What happens when light arrives? Light will pass through the cornea. It'll pass through the pupil, whose size is controlled by the iris. It'll pass through the lens, whose shape is controlled by the ciliary body. And then it'll pass through the vitreous humor until it hits the retina in the back of the eye. The lens needs to refract the light so that it focuses on a specific area to give us a sharp view of what's going on. Light is refracted by both the cornea and the lens. The lens is able to adjust its focus to help give us the best, sharpest vision possible. The rod's photoreceptors are more sensitive to light, so they function well in dim light, which is why when it's really late at night and you're walking around the house and the lights are all out, things seem sort of grayish. Basically, there's a light-sensitive pigment, a chemical that absorbs the energy from photons of the light and then breaks down. So rhodopsin breaks down. Its decomposition leads to a change in the charge across the rod's cell membrane, leading to the generation of a nerve impulse. The cones are also light sensitive, but they are broken down into three sets for the three different kinds of color: red, blue, and green. The chemical in them that will be absorbing the energy of the photons is the opsin proteins, which are very closely related to the rhodopsin of the rods. And depending on what combination of these three different kinds of cones are stimulated by light will affect what kind of color you see. If all of them are stimulated equally, you get white light. If none of them are stimulated, it's black. And people with color blindness can have different kinds of color blindness depending on which of the pigments they don't produce. So, the optic pathway, light enters the retina. The retina then sends the information down the optic nerve. The optic nerves meet at the optic chiasm, where they cross over so that the right side of each eye's field of vision goes to one side, the left side of each eye's field of vision goes to the other side. They then continue on into the thalamuses, and then we'll continue further back into the eye to reach the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. Metropia is normal vision, where people got 20/20 vision. They can see quite well for a human. Hyperopia is farsightedness. The eyeball is a little too sharp, so near objects are blurry. So you need a convex sort of lens to correct for that. And myopia is nearsightedness. Eyeball's a little too long, so things that are way far away end up being blurry. And in this case, you need a concave lens to help correct for this. Some common disorders associated with the eyeball are basically different types of ways of developing blindness. Cataracts. Cataracts is a loss of transparency of the lens, meaning that initially everything gets fuzzier and fuzzier because those little solids in the lens cause the light to scatter. But then slowly over time, the lens can get opaque enough that no light can pass through and the person becomes blind. Glaucoma. Glaucoma is when there's an extremely high ocular pressure in the eyeball, which leads to damage of the retina because the retina is very delicate. Often the peripheral vision is lost first, so that slowly over time, the area that they can see gets smaller and smaller. And then age-related macular disease. This is a degenerative disorder of the retina and pigment layers, starting in the macula lutea, hence the name. So basically what happens is it starts off the center of the person's field of vision starts to get fuzzy and black out, and slowly over time that will continue to spread and spread as the person loses more and more of the peripheral vision.